Coral reefs are
very
suffering
warm
a severe
day.
We did ask the
underwater
government.
heat wave this
The
year.
warmest day ever.
12 degrees hotter, willing to take you common.
The breakdown of our climate has begun. The ecological crisis can no longer be ignored.
This government has a fine record on climate change.
We are in open rebellion against our government, and we call upon every principled and peaceful citizen to rise with us. We have 3 demands. The government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency. The government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. The government must commission a National Citizens' Assembly, a group of citizens chosen by lot and reflective of the demographics of the UK, together with experts and stakeholders, to vote on recommendations on the climate and ecological emergency. We refuse to leave a dying planet to future generations by failing to act now.
It really isn't an exaggeration to say that the future of the human race is now at stake. The nature of the changes in climate and environment that we're living with threaten not only the well-being, but possibly the very being of our species and this planet in the long term. And in the middle term, they threaten some of the most vulnerable populations on Earth. It's not at all surprising that people in this urgent situation feel they've got to take non-violent, direct action. They've got to find a way of putting the case for the human race before those in power. That's what Extinction Rebellion is doing. That's what the Friday strikes are doing. And that's why I believe a wide, deep support from the public is needed to bring this matter fully to the attention of our political leaders, to show that we can actually achieve democratic change for the good of everybody in our world as well as in this country.
And thank you everyone for coming. Whoa, it's fantastic. Really great to see you all. Now, Brexit does not keep me awake at night. The political meltdown taking place in Britain does not keep me awake at night. Theresa May does not keep me awake at night, though she does often feature in my nightmares. The reason these issues, huge as they are, do not keep me awake at night is that I'm already sodding awake, because I'm fretting about things 1,000 times bigger. We are being faced simultaneously with a series of humongous existential crises. Climate breakdown, ecological cascading collapse, the disappearance of insects. Who knew they were important? The cascading collapse of marine ecosystems as well as terrestrial ones, driven primarily, it has to be said, by the food industry. Farming and fishing, the 2 most destructive industries on Earth. We give them a free pass on the basis that you can't criticize any industry that features in a children's book. We are faced with the disappearance of soil. We're faced with the contamination and disappearance in many parts of the world of fresh water. Just 2 days ago, we learned that air pollution is causing twice as much damage to our health as we previously thought. And before that point, we already knew that worldwide it was 3 times more deadly than AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. And yet what we see from our political and economic class is a mixture of indifference and denial, occasionally grading into despair. Now, people of my generation, and I spent years grappling with this, denied and denied and denied, either that there was a problem at all or that the problem was as important as we know it is. And then suddenly, a few years ago, what they were saying changed. Suddenly, instead of saying it's not an issue or it's not important, they said, okay, we accept it's an issue and it's important, but sadly, it's now too late to do anything about it. Between the denial and the despair, there was not one moment at which they said, it's real, it's an issue, and therefore we must act. And faced with this indifference, this despair, this denial, I began to fall into something resembling a state of despair myself. I thought people aren't going to see it. They refuse to see it. They don't want to know. And we tried to get mobilizations going, and we had small ones which flared up and then disappeared again like fireworks. We went up and we came down the same way. And I began to think, nothing is going to take this on. Nothing is going to tackle this. And then suddenly, two extraordinary movements emerge just where I thought, just at the moment I thought that hope had died. Extinction Rebellion and the climate strikes. And we honor and applaud all those magnificent people who have led these two converging and essential movements. Thank you to all of them. They give me hope where hope seemed absent. They give me determination where determination was flagging. And they give me belief that for the first time in years, a belief that we really can meet these issues head on and turn around our catastrophic political and economic systems so that they serve us rather than destroy us. And on that note, I want to introduce the wonderful speakers tonight. I'll be having a bit more of a go later on. But first of all, we have two fantastic people from Extinction Rebellion. Rachel Treharne, who's an Arctic ecologist and an Extinction Rebellion activist, and Zahora Plummer, who's also a great Extinction Rebellion activist. And we'll also be hearing from Lynette, who's 16 and represents the great youth surge, which has put so many of us greyheads to shame and is showing us the way forward. So I'm going to hand you over to the first of these wonderful people, to Rachel, and then we'll see how the evening goes on from there. But give her a great round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, so I'm Zahora, and this is Rachel, as George said, and we'll be doing a lot of the talking tonight. And neither of us are world-leading climate change experts by a long way. This isn't a very detailed talk about the climate modelling or cutting-edge solutions to do with climate change. We're just here as normal Oxford residents, really. But we have the Environmental Change Institute down the road who do fantastic talks like that. But saying that, how we're not experts, Rachel actually does have a PhD, and she does actually know actual stuff about science. Whereas I can't even do percentages.
Okay, so why is it that we're here doing this talk tonight? So like Zahora was just saying, so I do have background in science. I did my PhD at the University of Sheffield, and I've been studying the impacts that climate change is having on high-latitude ecosystems for the last 6 years. And during that time, I've also kind of increasingly felt that if you are a scientist and if you believe in your science, then you also have a certain level of responsibility to be an advocate for that science. So that's why I've also got involved with Extinction Rebellion here in Oxford. And so I'm going to be leading the first half of this talk, and that's just going to be a clear, simple roundup of the latest science of where we are on climate change. A lot of you in here probably will have heard at least some of that information before, but I think there's still real value in just talking through the full picture, if nothing else, just to kind of remind ourselves of the seriousness of the situation that we're talking about.
I'll be leading the second half of the talk, and in that I'll be demonstrating to you how our current political systems are completely failing to take adequate action for the severity of the situation. I'll also be explaining why we think that non-violent direct action is an appropriate response to the crisis that we're facing. And I'll also tell you a little bit about how you can actually get involved. And that how you can get involved part is a little bit of a reflection of my own journey really over the last 6 months. So like many people here, I've known about climate change for years and years. I grew up knowing about global warming. I came from a very kind of active political family. My job out of university was for Stop Climate Chaos, a climate change coalition organisation, and that was 15 years ago, and it felt urgent then. And I went on marches, and I signed petitions, and I wrote to my MP, and I did all of those things, the sorts of things that you guys probably do all the time as well. And then in my 20s, I became increasingly distracted from the whole thing. And I would see headlines on the news, more and more warnings from scientists. I would see more and more extreme weather events happening, and I would scroll past and I would think, oh, this is very, very bad. But I didn't know what to do about it. I felt very disempowered and very despairing. But more than that, I felt quite numb, like I just didn't really feel anything. And then the Paris Climate Agreement happened. And I was like, yes, brilliant, it's all been sorted out. I wasn't engaged, and now I don't have to be, because somebody else has done something about it. Yay, Obama. And then Brexit happened, and then Trump happened, and then the IPCC report came out last autumn, and then in quick succession the WWF report came out, the Living Planet report. And I suddenly re-engaged really quickly, but it was awful. Like, I felt completely overwhelmed, full of despair, and very, very powerless. And then about at that same moment, I met this boy who I really fancied. And he told me about Extinction Rebellion. And because that's what you do when people who you fancy tell you things, I went and looked them up. And I was like, oh my God, these guys actually are actually responding with the urgency. They're actually talking about this in the urgent way that I think this needs to be talked about. And I watched some videos and I read some stuff, and quite apart from the beautiful boy, I went off to a training weekend and I learnt about Extinction Rebellion. And barely a week after the training weekend, I was on the streets of London taking action. And so I can say personally that the moment that you start to do something, everything feels a whole lot better.
So that's what... So when we talk about climate change, and the way that I've been trained to talk about climate change for years now is to be optimistic, to focus on the positive stories that we can find. And that can be a really powerful thing, but it does also come with a real risk that we never actually sit down and face the reality of the situation that we're in, and instead we create what is really this false sense of security. So because of that, we're not going to do that today. We're actually going to take a step back, and we're going to be guided by this core Extinction Rebellion principle of tell the truth and act as if the truth is real. This isn't always an easy thing to do, and because of that, you might, at points during this talk, you might find yourself feeling sad or afraid or angry, and we just really want to make the point that those feelings are completely appropriate and completely rational. And I'd really encourage you not to turn away from those feelings, but actually to sit with them and really face up to them, because we don't actually get the chance to do that very often, and it's a really important part of looking at where we are and how we move forward. So the first thing I just want to talk about is the information that we have about climate change. What is the nature of this information? In science, we build knowledge through this process of review and consensus building. So that means we go right from individual work, individual publications from individual scientists, through to something like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And during that process, all the science in a field, so in this case climate change, is really intensively debated and critiqued and just really pulled apart by that scientific community. And what that means is that the conclusions that survive that process are really rigorous. So when we're talking about the IPCC, we're talking about really mainstream, completely non-controversial science. However, it also means that those conclusions are the ones that the most cautious and reticent members of that community are prepared to stand behind. So as well as being very rigorous, these conclusions can potentially be viewed as fairly conservative. But despite that, I'm sure many of us in here probably most of us have heard about, probably some of us have read the latest IPCC report, which came out late last year. And this looked at the difference in the impacts of climate change at 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. And the conclusions of this were really quite stark. So what the report found was that impacts at 2 degrees are much worse than the impacts we see at 1.5 degrees, and therefore that we must, if at all possible, keep to this 1.5 degree limit. But it's really important to say that 1.5 degree limit, that's not a safe level of climate change. we still see dangerous and severe impacts of climate change at 1.5 degrees. And just to kind of emphasize what this report really means, I just want to share with you what some of the scientists representing this, this mainstream, fairly conservative process have to say about the report. So Eric Solheim, Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme, says it's like a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We must put out the fire. Deborah Roberts is chair of one of the IPCC working groups, says it's a line in the sand, and what it says to our species is that this is the moment and we must act now. The next few years are probably the most important in our history. So what is this situation that we should all be so alarmed by? Where are we with climate change? This is the amount of warming we have experienced to date. So you can see it varies hugely across the world, but what we're looking at is an average temperature increase across the world of 1 degree. Already at this 1 degree of warming, we are seeing substantial detectable impacts on the natural world, particularly vulnerable ecosystems like coral reefs. We're seeing impacts on extreme events, on our ability to grow crops in many parts of the world, and even on things like heat-related mortality. Unquestionably, climate change is already changing and ending people's lives around the world. This is at 1 degree of warming. So what does the future hold? On this graph, the black line is showing you the emissions that have happened so far. And I'm just going to talk you through 3 kind of examples of what could potentially happen next. So firstly, let's imagine that we just wave a magic wand and we stop all our emissions now. So of course, warming doesn't stop immediately, the same way your car doesn't stop immediately when you apply the brakes. So we do see some additional warming. And that actually takes us to somewhere between around 1.3 to 1.7 degrees of warming by the end of this century. But this is our magic wand scenario. This is not possible, we know that. So instead, let's imagine that we don't do this, but we do keep all the promises we've made around the world to tackle climate change, including the pledges we've so far made under the Paris Agreement on climate change. What happens then? If we do that, we see warming at the moment of around 3 degrees by the end of this century. So that's our optimistic policies scenario there. So that's double that line in the sand that the IPCC have drawn for us. At this level of warming, we see more or less loss of coral reefs, loss of some Arctic sea ice. We see severe to extreme impacts in terms of inland flooding, coastal flooding, other extreme events, crop failure, heat-related mortality, impacts on fisheries. In addition to these things, we see a high risk of abrupt, irreversible impacts of climate change. Finally, what happens if we carry on behaving the way we're behaving today? If we do that, so business as usual, that takes us into this grey area up here, which, as you can see, leads to around 4 degrees or more of warming by the end of this century, according to the IPCC, as much as 6 degrees. This is beyond catastrophic as a scenario. This is something that we can't know or really understand the impacts of this. These scenarios are based on what we, describe what we expect to see based on our emissions. Do we always see what we expect with climate change? This is an animation that's not going to work, so I'm just going to tell you what it's going to show. So what it would show you is the extent and the thickness of sea ice in the Arctic. And for several years, we saw a period of steady decline in the extent of sea ice, which is what we expected to see. And then from around the late 2000s, we saw that the area of the thickest, the multi-year ice, dropped to just a fraction of what it had been just a few years before, around the millennium, in just a few years. And that's what this looked like in comparison to what we expected to see at the time. So why do we see things that we don't expect with climate change? We can't answer this whole question now, but to start doing that, we're just going to talk a little bit about feedbacks and tipping points. So this is an example of a feedback loop. In this case, this is the albedo effect. We all understand what this is. The albedo effect is the reason that if you go outside on a hot day wearing a white t-shirt, you don't get as hot as if you're wearing a black t-shirt. In this case, what we see happening is that as the climate warms, sea ice melts, and we replace that white reflective surface with something really dark and absorbent. And that dark absorbency takes up more heat, we see more ice melting, and we enter this vicious cycle that is a feedback loop. And that causes the process, so in this case of sea ice melt, to accelerate. This is an example of a feedback loop that we understand quite well. But there are lots of other feedback loops, and lots of them we really don't have such a good understanding of. So this example is the weakening of our natural sinks. By natural sinks, I mean forests and other ecosystems that naturally take up carbon and slow down climate change for us. But climate change is weakening the ability of these natural sinks to do that. For example, because forests are drying out, or for example, because they're being attacked more and more by insects which thrive in the warmer, drier conditions we're creating. So this image, the top left, this is forest in British Columbia in Canada, and all of the red coloration there is trees that have been killed by an outbreak of a single species of beetle. This outbreak, this single outbreak, caused more CO2 emissions than 40 years of wildfires across Canada. And you can imagine that trying to build these processes into our predictions of the future is very difficult. In addition, there's lots of other processes going on with natural sinks that we understand even less. Just an example, this is what I work on. This is the dieback of plant communities in the Arctic. This is something that is linked to climate change. It's happening more and more often, and it's weakening the Arctic carbon sink. But we didn't even know that this was happening until just a few years ago, and we were actually expecting the opposite to be happening. So with these processes that we don't have a good understanding of, often these are not fully represented or not represented in our predictions of the future. As somebody who works on some of these things, that is something that I find really genuinely frightening. So in addition to these processes, which we're not really certain about necessarily, we also have the complete unknowns, the just total surprises that are out there for us. This is a paper that was published less than a month ago, and it's looking at quite an extreme scenario. It's looking at business as usual in terms of our emissions for about another century. And what it finds is that in that scenario, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere get so high that actually cloud banks, so large kind of expanses of cloud, disperse quite abruptly. And what that does is add an extra 8 degrees of warming on top of the warming that we would expect to see as a result of emissions by that point. I'm not sharing this with you because I think we should all be really frightened about that 8 degrees. I don't think we should. I don't think this is a scenario, this is extreme, as I said. I don't think this would come to pass. But I'm sharing it with you because I think it's a really important reminder that as we create this increasingly unfamiliar world, there are going to be surprises. And as this scientist says, those surprises are probably not going to be pleasant. We can't talk about unexpected things with climate change without talking about tipping points as well. So tipping points is this idea that climate change sort of reaches a threshold after which some of those impacts kind of run away from us like a ball rolling down a hill when suddenly it accelerates, you can't grab it back. And again, this isn't something that's a kind of disaster movie scenario. This is a quote from the IPCC report. And it's saying that even in the region of temperature increase that we're kind of aiming for, 1.5 to 2 degrees, there's a moderate risk of tipping points. In this case, of destabilization of, ice loss from Greenland and Antarctica, which of course would be associated with a substantial level of sea level rise. So what does all this mean for that graph we looked at of the scenarios of where we could be heading based on our emissions? I think what it means is that we have to remember that our predictions of the future are terrifying, but also not based on a complete picture, and therefore that we can't treat these ranges of uncertainty as safety nets. We know we're already off the map in terms of the climate that we know. And as we head further and further into this grey area up here, we know less and less really about what we're letting ourselves in for. Having said that, there are some things we know about what we're letting ourselves in for. So we're going to talk just quickly a little bit about that. So firstly, one of those things is, of course, sea level rise. It's one of the things that comes to mind most often. Sea level rise is something that will affect hundreds of millions, potentially up to 1 billion people around the world, and a lot of people in the UK. In the UK, something like 30% of people live within 10 kilometres of the coast. This is a graphic, obviously, of London. The amount of flooding inundation that we'd see in London, just under 2 degrees. So for context, there's the O2, I think, has moved a little bit. But you can actually see where the O2 is supposed to be, this little island, which is a little bit frightening. And of course, this is a substantial level of inundation. But we also have to remember that other places around the world will see much more severe impacts. So this is Shanghai and the surrounding area, which you can see is largely inundated. And this is Miami, which is completely obliterated. Sea level rise isn't the only way that we'll lose land to climate change. We're already losing land to desertification. And in addition, as temperatures continue to rise, and particularly as we see more variable, unpredictable rainfall, it will become increasingly hard to grow crops in many parts of the world. This is showing you global hunger, which has been on a steady decline for several years. And in just the last few years, that trend has actually reversed, and it's now back up on the increase. And this report cited climate change and climate-related shocks as a key driver of this increase in global hunger. This is at 1 degree of warming. Of course, all these things also mean that people will be on the move. This estimate suggests that climate change could result in 150 million to 2 billion migrants within borders and across borders by 2050. If we take the midpoint of those estimates, we're talking about something like 1 in 9 people being on the move by 2050. And we only really need to think about the last few years to imagine the kind of political and social consequences of this. But of course, this is also about the human cost. The human cost of migration is enormous. And just to reflect that, we have this quote from Moving Stories, which is a climate outreach report, which I'd encourage you all to read, from this lady in Bangladesh who says, "Climate change has wrecked everything. Our people are living in other towns and cities like refugees. All I wanted was to grow old with my children and their children. But now they're gone, and I don't think they will ever return." Another key impact of climate change is more extreme events. This is something we all know we're seeing already. This is just a picture, this is a photo I took of my laptop screen last summer because I just could not believe that more than half of the top stories on BBC News were linked to extreme events linked to climate change. And again, this is another key point that is not just about numbers on a screen. This is about human cost. And with extreme events and with other impacts of climate change, often that human cost is particularly affecting people in the global south, women, children, people of colour, people whose voices we are least likely to hear. And just in recognition of that, I'm just going to hand over to Sahura who's going to read a testimony from Mint Mint Ai, who survived Cyclone Nargis, which made landfall in Myanmar in 2008.
On the 2nd of May 2008, Mint Mint Ai, her husband, and their 2 daughters, aged 3 and 6, took their boat to a nearby island to buy wood. The family lived from selling timber in Bagale and other towns. The family planned to sleep in the boat. They saw nothing unusual in the wind, which gathered steadily through the afternoon. By 9 p.m, it had reached a force so frightening that they abandoned the small craft for the shore and scuttled into the first house they could find. Some 25 others were already cowering there. As the cyclone approached, it drove massive waves up the vast tidal river that drained from the Ayeyarwady Delta into the Indian Ocean. The floodwater surged over the island where Min Min Ai's family were marooned, tearing the house from its stilt legs and driving its collapsing structure into a nearby haystack. I couldn't see anything. All I know is that people were grabbing the haystack and trying to hold on to each other as the water poured at us. My husband and I held hands, and we each held one of the children. Cast into the water, the couple grabbed the branches of a tree only to be swallowed up in the drifting haystack. Min Min Ai lost her husband's hand forever. Minutes later, she said the realization crept over her that life was also slipping from her 3-year-old daughter, who was still in her grasp. Stricken by grief, she gave herself up to the current, preferring to hold the tiny body of her daughter than try to save herself. Although I knew my little daughter was dead, I told myself I would never let her go. The wind and the water had been too much for her, and she became as limp as a piece of cloth. Min Min Ai said she slipped in and out of consciousness until fortune saw her washed up on another island. Bits of wood were piling on top of me, and I was stuck beneath them. I struggled to get out, and I realized I had let go of my child. I tried to grab her again, but I could only find her leg. Then another wave hit us, and because her body was so slippery, I lost her.
So this is hard-hitting stuff, but it is important that we face up to it. When we talk about the victims of climate change and of ecological breakdown, of course, we're not just talking about people, we're also talking about other species. This graphic is just showing the observed numbers of extinctions in comparison to what we'd expect. You can see in the purple down near the bottom. And this is telling us, of course, what we all know, which is that we are in the 6th global mass extinction. And I'm sure, again, lots of us heard about the WWF Living Planet report, which came out last year and told us that just since the 1970s, we'd wiped out 60% of animal populations. This is a really difficult number to kind of comprehend. So for context, if we did that with human populations, we'd be talking about emptying North America, South America, Europe, Africa, China, and Oceania. I have double-checked that. And so this is about a loss of numbers, a loss of abundance, as well as the loss of individual species. Both of those things contribute to the ecological crisis that we find ourselves in. And when we were preparing this talk, Zohara and I were just talking about how it's really difficult to actually see this loss of abundance. Our baselines shift over time. Each generation thinks the amount of nature that they see is normal. And I actually think this book that I've been reading recently kind of encapsulates that really well. So I'm just going to read you this little passage from it. In the dark, there are far, far more moths out and about than ever there are butterflies during the daytime. It's just that we don't see them. Or at least we didn't until the invention of the automobile. The headlight beams of a speeding car on a muggy summer's night in the countryside, turning the moths into snowflakes and crowding them together the faster you went, in the manner of a telephoto lens, meant that the true, startling scale of their numbers was suddenly apparent, not least as they plastered the headlights and the windscreen until driving became impossible, and you had to stop the car to wipe the glass surfaces clean. Of all the myriad displays of abundance in the natural world in Britain, the moth snowstorm was the most extraordinary. Yet now, after but a short century of existence, it has gone. So let's come on to this question that we really posed with the title of this talk. Could climate change possibly, well, climate change and ecological breakdown possibly be enough to wipe out humanity? I think to tackle this question, we have to really think about the significance it is of what we're asking. So we said right at the start of this talk that we know climate change is changing and ending people's lives around the world. We know that we're currently heading to overshoot scenarios, which will almost certainly cause unprecedented levels of human suffering. So given that, should it really take a threat of complete human extinction to motivate us to act? Or do we genuinely feel comforted by the idea that whatever happens, somewhere, some people will survive? But despite that, let's take this as a theoretical question of could this be possible? And to do that, I'm just going to draw your attention to one paper which was published in PNAS in 2017, which looked at this question, and it looked at low probability, high impact climate change scenarios, including scenarios where climate change is an existential threat. So those are scenarios with a probability of 5%. I'm just going to read you a quote from one of the authors of this paper. And then we're just going to take a minute of complete quiet just to absorb some of what we've talked about so far tonight. So I'll read you the quote. When we say 5% probability high impact event, people may dismiss it as small. But it's equivalent to a 1 in 20 chance the plane you're about to board will crash. We would never get on that plane with a 1 in 20 chance of it coming down. But we are willing to send our children and grandchildren on that plane. So let's just take a minute to process this, and then we'll move on with the second half of the talk. We'll bring you back to us then.
Okay, everybody, thank you. The minute's up. So thank you for being with us this far. So if you look at the UK government's record in the last 10 years, you can see scrapping renewable energy schemes, voting for the expansion of Heathrow, which is probably the most carbon-intensive infrastructure project imaginable, and selling off the Green Investment Bank, a whole ton of policies. But we live in a functioning democratic system, right? I mean, kinda.
Let's take a time.
Yeah. Well, what's the latest? So you would think that compared globally, we do, right? And we have checks and balances, and we have a judiciary. So you would think that they would be holding successive governments to account to stop this kind of stuff from happening. But actually, that isn't the case. So this is an organisation called Plan B, and they took the UK government to court last year in July 2018 for acting contrary to the climate change commitments of Paris and causing serious harm to human welfare and breaching international obligations. And Parliament's very own Climate Change Committee confirmed that the Paris Agreement describes a higher level of ambition than the one which forms the basis of the UK's legislated emission reductions target. But Plan B still lost. The High Courts didn't do anything about it. So, given this, what is an appropriate social response to this situation? The normal channels are not working. There's a clue in the name, Extinction Rebellion. We believe that we need to rebel. Now, the rhetoric around rebellion is very much associated with the left, revolutions and that kind of thing. But we believe that actually climate change poses a threat to the values of everyone on every political persuasion. And actually rebellion is an appropriate response, whatever your political perspective. So we have some old friends from GB 101. I'm quite excited to see them again. Locke and Hobbes. So climate change is a threat to the individual and property rights that liberals hold so dear. It's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of UK homes are going to get flooded, are going to get damaged by storms. This is a clear violation of property rights. And the rights of our children are certainly not guaranteed. So Locke said, he had a thing called the right of revolution. And he said, when a government fails to protect the lives and livelihoods of its citizens, the people have a right to rebel. And then we have Hobbes, dear old Hobbes. The conservative perspective about climate change and rebellion is really not ever examined or ever talked about enough. And it's kind of strange because climate change is diametrically opposed to the idea of conserving the status quo. And it's a threat multiplier. So it makes war and terrorism and all those threats to national security and to order itself much, much greater. And those are the cornerstones of conservative thought. And Hobbes said that when the state derives authority from its willingness and ability to maintain order and security, and the obligations of the subjects to the sovereign last as long and no longer than the power lasteth by which he is able to protect them. So Hobbes is kind of saying, you've got a case to rebel. So that's great, we've got some theory, but what are we rebelling for? We're not just talking about like random uprisings in the street for no particular reason at all, definitely not. Extinction Rebellion has 3 demands. So demand 1 is that the government must tell the truth about the ecological emergency, reverse inconsistent policies, and work alongside the media to communicate with citizens. So governments conduct public health campaigns based on accurate scientific evidence all the time. Seatbelts, drink driving, all kinds of things. And we're essentially asking for the same thing. We're saying don't shy away from the truth, tell the truth, and give your citizens accurate information so that we can have mass behaviour change and also so they understand where we're going and what policies need to be put in place. Demand 2. The government must enact legally binding policy measures to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025 and cooperate so we're part of a global economy which runs on half a planet's worth of resources per year. So this is pretty ambitious. The IPCC says net zero by 2050. But we know from Rachel's slides that leaves out a whole load of known unknowns and a load of, more terrifyingly, unknown unknowns. So we're kind of like saying, so you've got a teenage child or a young adult child, there are many parents here in the room, and they've got a really, really important job interview, and they've got to get a train to go there. And you say to them the night before, oh, what time's your train? Oh, it's at 9:07. Oh, so what time are you going to get to the station? Oh, there's a bus that gets me there at 9:03. And you'd be like, how about getting on the earlier bus? Because, you know, there might be some traffic, there might be some delays you don't know about. No, it'll be fine, I'll get the bus, it gets at 9:03. No, just get the earlier bus. And we're basically saying the same thing. Like, let's not kind of allow, like, any feedback loops to kind of take place. Let's just aim for 6 years. But net carbon neutral in 6 years, that's quite a big ask. And lots of you might be thinking, yeah, in your dreams. So how would we actually do that? We could just stick with the IPCCs and just carry on. But, you know, we'll be on that bus, potentially watching our train, driving out to the station. We think we can get there with something like a mobilization like that happened in the Second World War. So in this period, the entire economy transformed almost overnight. Factories that were producing cars suddenly, within weeks, were producing something for the war effort. Over half of our national expenditure was devoted to winning the war. We had a 95% drop-off in animal foodstuff imports and a 70% drop in butter imports. So we know we've done it before. Like we know it politically and economically, it is feasible if we really put our minds to it. Now, with this slide, I'm not a massive patriot, and I'm certainly not a fan of war at all. But this narrative around the Blitz spirit and everybody pulling together is very, very powerful, and it doesn't belong to one end of the political spectrum. There are very many positive things about what happened in the war, and there's an academic paper which directly compares the transformation that took place in wartime to what we could learn from climate change. And they say there are some key things to learn. So the positive things were that there was a real sense of solidarity and shared experience. We were heading for the same thing. We knew what we were trying to do, and we were all pulling in the same direction. There was reasonable equality. So generally speaking, you couldn't buy more rations because you had more money. The people had similar amounts of stuff. And there was shared meaning. We were appealing to future generations and to the greater good. So they say there's real things that we can learn from this time. However, there's a big downside, which is it wasn't very democratic at all. Things were just driven through, and there was a big democratic deficit. And that leads us to our third demand of Extinction Rebellion. So we demand a citizens' assembly to oversee the changes as part of creating a democracy fit for purpose. So a citizens' assembly is essentially populating a decision-making assembly, maybe 100 people or so, by selecting people at random from the population, a bit like jury service. So you have totally random and therefore hopefully representative selection of the population. And the assembly make decisions in an informed, fair manner. They are presented with the facts by experts who disclose their funding, and they understand what's happening with climate change, and they understand about policies. And you take some time to discuss and deliberate, and it's a thoughtful process. And when citizens' assemblies are used, they actually come up with really, really good policies. And I can think of some things they could work on at the moment, but that's not too much that. So, this is the Sortition Foundation. So Extinction Rebellion works with this organisation called the Sortition Foundation, which are experts in setting up citizens' assemblies. And the real advantage of them is that it completely gets rid of party politics. Like, people aren't there representing a particular political party with a particular manifesto, and there's not internal political wrangling. You're just making decisions based on the facts all together. And it also gets out of the short-term election thinking, which is kind of related. But most of all, it gets away completely from the whole lobbying and corruption and power that the carbon-heavy industries have over our elected representatives and over the system. So citizens' assemblies have been used very successfully in Ireland. They set up the terms for the referendum on gay marriage, and it also set up the terms for the referendum on abortion, and that was considered to be very fair, and it worked really well across the whole of Ireland. And then they were also used to decide about nuclear waste in Australia. So it has been used successfully around the world. And I wanted to mention like one small thing that happened locally in Oxford, and which I think is an example of the kind of the way that politicians are hemmed in by the system, even if they know what is right. So Extinction Rebellion went to see Annalisa Dodds a couple of weeks ago, and we said, please, can you oppose the expressway? And she said, because it's ridiculous building new roads, there's a climate emergency, all the housing's going to be spread out along it, everybody who goes and lives in those houses will have to have cars, you're basically setting people up for a carbon-intensive lifestyle, and that's what's got to change. And she said, I can't oppose it, because if I do, then the chances of me being able to push for affordable housing along that road will be severely reduced. And I was elected on the basis of that I would get as much affordable housing as possible in Oxford. Now, whether you agree with her analysis about whether it tied her hands on that or not, it doesn't really matter. But the point is that they have all of these things pulling them in all these different directions, all this party politics, and just more things than we probably even know. Whereas citizens' assemblies just kind of bypass all of that. It was actually the way the Greeks originally set up democracy. So, these are our demands. And that's what we're rebelling for. But how are we going to actually get people to do this? And what do we mean by rebelling? And will it work? And at this point, it's really important to talk about this motto again of Extinction Rebellion. Tell the truth and act as if the truth is real. And this really shifts the discourse away from how climate change has been communicated in the last, I would say, 15 years or so. So, I was definitely, since I was at Stop Climate Chaos, this was the thing. If you're trying to motivate people, scaring the shit out of them is a really bad strategy. So the idea is, amongst people in traditional environmental NGOs, in the media, all kinds of people, is that climate change is really bad, but you can't tell people, you can't terrify them, you can't do what we just did on stage, because then they'll freeze, they'll become overwhelmed, and they'll completely won't act at all, and it'll be counterproductive. And that's almost certainly true. But if you're trying to motivate everybody, that's a very, very important point. But what about if you're not trying to motivate every single person? So this is a rough illustrative graph to show how people respond about climate change. It's not real data, it's just to illustrate my point. So we've got people over here who really don't care, like they're not going to do anything at all, couldn't give a shit. And then we've got people over here, committed environmental activists, who are changing their behaviour, actively changing their behaviour. And then you've got lots of people in the middle who think it's good to look after the environment, but are not actually changing their behaviour very much, or to sort of different degrees. So the idea is that if you tell them and basically scare the shit out of them, then this will happen. And they'll just go, oh my God, this is too much. And they'll feel too small, they'll feel too scared, they'll run away, they'll just be completely distracted, and distract themselves with whatever it is that they're interested in, Love Island or their children or DIY or drinking or whatever. But what about if that isn't actually the case for everybody? What about if, when you tell the truth, this happens? You get a small bunch of people who go, oh my God, this is the most important thing that anybody has ever told me. We're heading for 4 degrees of warming. We've got to do something about it. And these people are called upstanders. So these people act differently for whatever reason. They have a different mindset, different values, something's happened in their life. They might have a different religion or spiritual practice, which makes them stand up and say, I'm going to act. I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to rebel on behalf of the greater good based on science. So that's a nice theory. I'd made some graphs. But where's the evidence of that, really? And I think the evidence is kind of in this room tonight, because you guys all came to a talk called Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. Can you imagine a normal NGO sitting down saying, what should we call our public meeting? Oh, let's call it Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. No, you can't call it that. Nobody will come. Yet, here you all are. So Extinction Rebellion was launched on the 31st of October last year. That's not even 6 months ago. Like, that's a crazy short amount of time. We had Christmas and everything. And nearly 200 people have been arrested in that time. And so I think this shows that it is true that upstanders will stand up. Loads of people will be scared and they're not interested and they don't care. But a certain number of people will stand up and say, this is important, I'm going to do something about this. The other thing about telling the truth is about and acting as if it's real, that's the really important part, is typical NGOs and awareness-raising methods are leafleting, marching, sending an email to your MP, doing all of those kinds of things. And they're really, really important, and they do generate really good results for lots of issues. But actually, we don't think that's an appropriate response for an issue that's potentially existential, and it's urgent, and there are powerful forces actively trying to stop change from happening. So we think the appropriate response is something else, which I'm going to get to. But there's something here about your actions and your words matching up. So if you give somebody a leaflet and it tells them that climate change is terrible and severe and it might cause human extinction, but you've just given them a leaflet, then there sends a kind of cross message. It's the implicit message, it can't be that bad, because if it was that bad, surely people would be in the streets. You know, so there's kind of a dissonance there, and I think it's what makes people think that what you're saying isn't true. And I think this is the level of action we've got to with the kind of say it's bad, but it's not that bad because it's too scary. My friend bought herself a bamboo toothbrush recently, and she told me about it very proudly, and I was very pleased for her, but yeah. The other thing about telling the truth is fear is actually a very useful emotion. It keeps us safe. And I don't think it is always paralyzing. It's very rational to be acutely afraid of what you've just heard from Rachel. And we have 3 responses in the brain, which is fight, flight, and freeze. And fight and flight are both actions. So I don't think that fear is completely a freezing emotion. But fear-based campaigns do fail, and they fail when you don't tell people what they can do. If you just make people scared, but you don't tell them what they can do, then they do totally fail. You've got to give people a sense of personal urgency. agency, not urgency, but we've also got urgency. So I've told you the demands, and I've told you that we think that we can get a percentage of the population to act. But what do we mean by rebelling exactly? And will it work? So this is what we mean by rebelling. Strategic, non-violent, direct action. A major system of resistance based upon the assumption that hierarchical systems can be modified or destroyed by withdrawal of submission, cooperation, and obedience. There are 4 key principles of strategic non-violent direct action, particularly Extinction Rebellions. There's lots and lots of, it's got a long and proud history. So the first principle is it must be respectful. And non-violence isn't just limited to not smashing somebody in the face. It's actually something much more profound than that. The root of the word that we've translated into non-violence is from the Sanskrit, and the Sanskrit is a very ancient language. And there's a kind of meaning from the very original, which means a state of such open-heartedness there is no room for hatred. But also on a more mundane level, if you're respectful, people will like you, and then they're more likely to agree with you. But also, it helps limit the risk of things escalating into physical violence, which we absolutely do not recommend at all. The second thing is it must be disruptive. So marches are really nice, they're fantastic. These one-day marches, and you go, and they've got really funny banners, and then you really like them, and then you look at the pictures on The Guardian the day after and say, oh, I saw that one. And they're very beautiful, but people who are not on the marches, they just walk past, they don't care. It doesn't impact on their lives. So Extinction Rebellion's disruption is low-level entry. So you just have to have a body and a mind and place it somewhere. It's not about having special expertise. It's not about having to get to faraway remote sites. It's not about scaling high buildings. It's economic disruption en masse, mainly in capital cities. And sacrificial. So it's not always sacrificial, but it's helpful. So people, if they see you striking or going to prison or doing something like that, where you are making a personal sacrifice, you get sympathy and you show you're serious, and it really does capture people's imagination. So we remember the force feeding of the suffragettes and the hunger of the Jarrow marchers and the poverty of striking miners who stuck with it day in, day out. And that sticks. It sticks in history. And then the fourth one is it creates a backfiring response. So one good example of this is the Frac 3 incident in Preston. So a backfiring response, is when authorities take action which backfires on them because of you've taken non-violent direct action. So the Frac 3 thing in Preston, there's fracking going on, and it's been going on for about a year more now, and lots of people were arrested, and it didn't get any media attention, and nobody really knew about it. And then 3 or 4 people took a lorry and stayed on it for about 4 days and nights. And they were arrested, and they were charged, and they were sent to prison. And it was considered to be a totally disproportionate response. So there was actually quite a big outcry on the media. It was the most amount of attention that the fracking in Lancashire had ever got. And people who weren't that interested still thought it was a disproportionate response. So people don't care, if they don't care about your cause, or they don't necessarily approve of your actions, if they see that you've been inappropriately punished, people do get their sympathy. So this is what we mean by rebelling, but will it work? So this is Erica Chenoweth, Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. And she has studied a lot of non-violent action. So she collected all of the violent and non-violent uprisings since 1900. There were over 300. She assessed them very carefully with criteria. There's a paper you can read if you want. And she found that non-violent direct action is twice as likely to succeed as violent action. But also, most importantly, you do not need everybody. You do not need everybody at all. You don't need 75% of the population, you don't need 50% of the population, you don't need 25%, you don't need 10%, you don't need 5%. The figure that she found, the upper figure that she found, was 3.5% of the population need to rebel in order to change a system. But it does depend on the type of action. So this is one of the classics. So a successful movement that used the 4 principles that I outlined before. And they succeeded with far, far less than 3.5% of the population. So before the mid-1950s, the American Civil Rights Movement was trying all the usual political channels, and it wasn't really having much impact. And then from the 50s onwards, they just changed tack, and they moved to nonviolent strategic direct action, with several hundred people going to prison and thousands of people getting arrested. And one example of one of those campaigns is the Freedom Riders. So in the southern segregated states, you couldn't go on a bus or a train. Black and white people couldn't sit in the same place. And Freedom Riders deliberately sat in the place where they're not supposed to sit. It started with 13 people. It must have been pretty scary. And it ended with 400 people. In the summer of '61, just under 400 people went to prison, and they deliberately chose a jail, not bail tactic. And they were sent to prison in quite a grotty, horrible prison, and it really aroused the sympathy of the American public, and it really got a lot of media attention. And within a year, they had changed that policy on the buses and trains. So it happened really quickly. So this is what Extinction Rebellion have done. 180 people were arrested in October and November last year. I was one of those people who was arrested. I think Extinction Rebellion has a different energy, a new kind of energy. It's doing something slightly different, that's capturing things in a different way, and I think it's also got the advantage of timing, that things are really, really, really urgent. I do want to say something about getting arrested briefly, though. We are incredibly privileged. We're incredibly privileged to be in a country where you can call a meeting with 350 people here and I'll, shout about rebellion and not expect people to be bashing on the doors, armed guards. But also, my own experience of getting arrested was a very privileged one. I'm white, I'm middle class, and I can navigate bureaucracies very easily. And if I had been, a young black man or somebody with mental health problems, or if I looked unconventional with piercings and tattoos, you do get treated very differently by the police. So I did definitely want to just kind of acknowledge that. And some of you might be sitting there thinking, God, well, this is all great, and I know the Matrix thing was really bad, but this all sounds a bit too much, I'm not sure, and, maybe we should just go through the proper channels for a bit longer, maybe. Maybe we should get some more Green MPs, or maybe we should green up Labour, or maybe we should green up the Conservatives, or maybe we should do a social media thing, or maybe we should have a march, or maybe we should be smaller, or we should be neater, or quieter, or just a bit less disruptive. Or maybe somebody else will do it. Maybe this is all very well, but not you and not your family. Maybe, yeah, it's possible. But really, we are facing 4 degrees plus of warming. And the window by which we can act is closing literally month by month. That is the situation we're in. And we are still able to change policy. So if we act now, we can actually change things. And every fraction of a degree of warming that we stop will make a difference to the lives of millions of people. Every single fraction of a degree of warming that we prevent. And this leads me to another really important point. With climate change, it's not like where you're fighting Brexit, and if you stop it happening, it doesn't happen, and you know it's not going to happen, and then everything's fine because you can say, it didn't happen, we sorted that out. We can still change policies, and those fractions of a degree of warming are really, really important. But things are going to get really bad, regardless. And so you're in a slightly difficult or conflicting position, because on one hand, you can do something and you can change policies, and we have got power still. But on the other hand, it might not seem like we might not win. There is no win, there's no end point. And so you have to kind of sit with those two kind of uncomfortable things both at the same time. And I think the second point, that things are going to get really, really bad, it does lead you to examine your deepest motivations. It's like, do you just act because you're going to win? Do you just or do you just take action anyway? And I think it goes back to your very, very core values about who you are and why you're doing things. So I'm finishing now, you'll be pleased to know. Only 2 more slides. This is Kate Marvel. She is a top climate scientist. And this is her take on the whole kind of motivation and why you might want to act thing. As a climate scientist, I'm often asked to talk about hope. Climate change is bleak, the organisers say. Tell us a happy story. Give us some hope. The problem is, I don't have any. What we need is courage. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. Thank you so much for listening.
She is a 16-year-old school striker, and she's got an address to make.
It can sometimes feel like each individual can't make a difference. All this climate change stuff can seem a bit too big. How could there be anything that we could do against a force that we can't see on the streets and yet threatens to change every one of our lives? Many young people who I have spoken to have felt especially disempowered. What could a child do to make a difference in a world that is dominated and controlled by the actions of an older generation? But that hasn't stopped us. Last month, Oxford was one of the highest attending areas for the student strike, and probably the most attended per city area. We are doing all that is in our power, even if it may not be much, because that is all that we have, and we want to use it. Last weekend, we spent our Saturdays making placards, and this school week we have spent recruiting more classmates to join us tomorrow at Bond Square. Around the country, students have been negotiating with their schools in the hope of support, and in some scenarios it is working. My school sent a letter to parents saying that they thought it was fantastic to see and that they wanted to bring it further. We have faith in the action of protesting. I think we need deeds, not words, this time around. I hope you have faith too. Many politicians, climate change deniers, world leaders have been criticised for acting like children. While on one hand I agree that they may need to grow up, I do have a qualm with it. I believe they should be told to act more like the children, doing all that is in their power in order to make a change. I'd encourage you to be more like us too. For many of us, these strikes are not just about the political impacts, but about affirming our mindset, affirming that we acknowledge this to be a problem and to be a concern of young people. Now, it is your turn to affirm that you will represent us. It can sometimes feel like each individual can't make a difference. But that is where we are wrong. True, if every individual who feels disempowered did nothing, then there'll be no change. But if every individual who would have done nothing does something, then we can fight this. One of the most empowering things about this movement is that it reaches out to anyone. You don't have to have already regarded yourself as an activist. It reaches out for anyone, regardless of who you are or what you have already done. And that applies to everyone. We all have something in our power to give. I want to have a beautiful, sustainable world to live in. I want to have the chance to go out and see the sun and the birds and the trees. I want to have the chance to not live in fear of being flooded or caught up in wildfires and droughts. I want to have the chance to live. And at the moment, it's not happening that way. And I'm not getting it. Last year, the report said that we only have 12 years to make a difference. 12 years? It looks like you're going to have to act now. By the time I am 80, we will have had around 4 degrees of warming if we don't significantly change our system. Will I be the last generation to become old? The suffragettes rebelled by campaigning for a voice. We need to rebel by campaigning for that voice to be listened to. For young people, that starts by getting you to listen to us, to affirm that you will represent us too. Because we have all seen the statistics. We have all read the articles. But are you listening? If you are, then what could possibly prevent you from acting? Thank you.
That was Lynette. Thank you very much, Lynette.
Well, thank you everyone for those fantastic presentations. And yeah, we need to be scared in order to see how much we have to do. And then we need to do it. Now, people often ask me, am I optimistic or am I pessimistic? And my answer is that I'm pessimistic about what people are doing to each other, doing to this wonderful planet, but I'm optimistic about what we are. Because old Thomas Hobbes was wrong. We are not engaged in a war of all against all. It's simply not true. He could be forgiven for believing that. He just witnessed the ravages of the English Civil War. He believed in the doctrine of original sin. His understanding of evolutionary biology was confined to the book of Genesis. But today, we know it is simply wrong. There's a huge amount of scientific work across many different fields: neuroscience, anthropology, evolutionary biology, social psychology, showing that while we all have a bit of selfishness and greediness, in the majority of people, that's down here. Those are values, characteristics that are not dominant. They're subordinate to our principal values, which it turns out are altruism, empathy, community feeling, benevolence, wanting other people to be okay. And yet, we are constantly assured that we're not like this at all. In fact, it's almost the doctrine of our age that we are inherently selfish and greedy, and this is a good thing, because this can be leveraged as the invisible hand in the market which is going to deliver all good things to everybody, because in pursuing our self-interest, of course, according to neoliberal theology, I was going to say ideology, but it's actually theology. According to neoliberal theology, this invisible hand with its godlike properties will actually enrich everybody, and then everybody becomes happier by being selfish and greedy. Well, they think it makes sense. But it is simply founded on a fallacy. The science does not support it at all. It is nonsense. It is junk science, which is at the root of that ideology. Broadly speaking, we're a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. And I mean it. Actually, again, the science shows very clearly that those people in positions of power, many of them are radically different to the human norm. They seem to be missing those components, altruism and empathy in particular, that the rest of us possess. And in this case, selfishness and greed really are at the top of the list. This is where we're going wrong, ladies and gentlemen. Why are we letting these bastards rule us? There's a very interesting analysis by Kenneth Mackay, a Canadian professor of sociology, who's looked at the cultures that have become extinct, where they should have been to one of these talks, but because they didn't, they went over the edge, and they slipped into the extinction that we're talking about as a prospect, a possibility for humanity in general now. And he was saying, well, what is the common characteristic of all these cultures? Is it that they became over-complex? Is it that they had a particular way of engaging with the living world, which was disastrous, or with each other, were they particularly warlike? And what he found was that the common denominator was they were all governed by oligarchies, by a very small number of people who had almost absolute power over everybody else. And that the interests, the short-term interests of the oligarchs were radically different to the long-term interests of society. And so though everybody else might have wanted to do things differently, these people were saying, our interests are pursued by doing it this way. Now, does that seem at all familiar in the 21st century? You know, we think about the Koch brothers, we think about Donald Trump, we think about Exxon, we think about BP, we think about this tiny handful of billionaires and corporations who want to do it their way, regardless of the impacts on the rest of us. And then we think of the rest of society who are either indifferent or in denial or really want things to be different. But the great majority of people are not saying, actually, we want to be hell-bound towards extinction because that suits our short-term interests. Now, I'm not saying that even the Koch brothers are saying we want everybody to become extinct, though one or two of their fellow billionaires, Peter Thiel being an example, seem to be heading in that direction. But they will pursue their interests regardless of whether we become extinct or not. Because for them, that short-term interest, their money in the bank, their place on the world rich list, their power over governments is the thing that counts, and the rest is irrelevant. Now, what we see is some version of this reflected in most of the mainstream media. Now, to own a newspaper or a television company, you have to be a billionaire. And so the world is portrayed to us by people who are radically different from the rest of us, not just in terms of the amount of money they have in the bank, but generally in terms of their psychological profile as well. And they're telling us, this is how it is, this is how people are, this is how they behave. And you say, well, that maybe is how you are and how you behave, but it's not how the rest of us are. But again and again, what is in the media is mistaken for public opinion. When people are exposed to what is happening, when people are given the opportunity to act, enough people are ready to do it. And with Extinction Rebellion, with the youth climate strikes, we are seeing the rising that I have been waiting for the 33 years of my campaigning life. I honor these people. I want us all to honor them. And I want us to see that this is the beginning, not of the end, but the beginning of the beginning of the great mass movement so many of us have been hoping to see for so long. It starts this year, ladies and gentlemen, and it starts with us. Thank you.
We refuse to leave a dying planet to future generations by failing to act now.